The night Clara Whitlock found a dying man on her doorstep, she had two choices: let him bleed out in the storm, or break the one rule that had kept her safe for 26 years, never let anyone in. She chose wrong. Or maybe she chose right. Either way, that decision would unravel everything she thought she knew about survival, about safety, and about the difference between being alone and being free. If you want to see how one storm can change everything, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The wind came first. It always did in Frost Hollow, screaming down from the northern mountains like something furious and alive, rattling the shutters of Clara Whitlock's cabin until the whole structure groaned in protest. She'd lived through 26 autumns in these hills, and she knew the language of storms the way some women knew recipes or prayers, by heart, by instinct, by the prickling at the back of her neck that said, "Take cover." This one was different. Clara stood at her kitchen window, hands braced against the counter, watching the sky turn the color of a bruise. The thermometer outside had dropped 15 degrees in the last hour. The chickens had gone silent in their coop. Even the old dog, Keeper, who usually slept through anything, was pacing by the door with his ears pinned back. "Settle down," she told him, though her own pulse was climbing. The first drops of rain hit the roof like flung gravel. Within seconds, it became a roar. Sheets of water so thick she couldn't see past the porch rail. Lightning cracked open the sky, and in that brief, brilliant flash, Clara saw her property, as if through a stranger's eyes. The tilting fence she'd been meaning to fix, the woodpile still only half covered, the garden rows already turning to mud. She turned away from the window and started her storm routine. Candles on the table, matches in arm's reach. The battery radio pulled from the cupboard, its antenna extended. She checked the wood stove. Damper adjusted, fire built up, but not roaring. The power would go out. It always did. She was filling a pot with water from the tap when Keeper started barking. Not his regular bark, the one he used for deer in the garden or the mail truck on Thursdays. This was different, urgent, almost panicked. "Quiet," Clara said sharply. He barked again, louder, and scratched at the door. Clara crossed the small kitchen in 4 strides and grabbed his collar. "I said—" The sound cut her off. A crash, heavy and wooden, from somewhere near the porch. Then silence. Then another sound, thinner, that might have been the wind but also might have been something else. Keeper lunged toward the door, nearly pulling her off balance. "Fine," Clara muttered. She grabbed her father's old rain slicker from the hook and shrugged into it, then picked up the shotgun she kept by the door. Not loaded. She wasn't fool enough to keep it loaded in the house, but heavy enough to make a point. The moment she opened the door, the storm tried to rip it from her hands. Wind drove rain into her face like needles. She squinted into the darkness, one hand shielding her eyes, the other gripping the shotgun like a club. "Hello?" Nothing. Just wind and water and the violent thrashing of tree branches. She stepped onto the porch, boots squelching. Keeper pushed past her and ran to the edge, barking at something Clara couldn't see. "Get back here!" Lightning flashed again, and this time Clara saw it. A shape on the ground near the porch steps, dark and crumpled, too big to be an animal. Her stomach clenched. "Hello?" No answer. She descended the steps slowly, shotgun raised, heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. Rain plastered her hair to her face. Water ran into her eyes. She blinked it away and moved closer. The shape was a man. He was lying face down in the mud, one arm stretched toward the porch as if he'd been trying to crawl. His clothes were soaked through, dark coat, torn at the shoulder, boots caked with mud. Blood spread in thin streams from somewhere Clara couldn't see, mixing with the rain and pooling beneath him. Keeper whined and nosed at the man's hand. "Back!" Clara ordered. Then, louder to the man, "Can you hear me?" Nothing. She crouched down, keeping the shotgun close, and reached out to touch his shoulder. His coat was cold. Beneath it, she could feel the faint, uneven rise and fall of breathing. Alive. Barely. Clara's mind raced. She didn't know this man, didn't recognize his coat or his boots or the dark hair matted against his skull. Frost Hollow was small enough that strangers stood out, and she would have noticed someone new, which meant he was passing through, or running from something. Smart money said leave him. Go back inside, lock the door, call the sheriff when the phone lines came back up. Let someone else deal with this. Her hands tightened on the shotgun. But the storm wasn't letting up. If she left him out here, he'd be dead by morning, if he wasn't already. And she'd have to live with that. She'd have to walk past this spot every day and know she'd let a man die on her property because she was too afraid to do the decent thing. Clara swore under her breath. Then she set the shotgun down, grabbed the man under his arms, and pulled. He was heavier than he looked. Dead weight, all muscle and soaked fabric. She managed to drag him up the steps one at a time, his boots thumping against the wood, his head lolling. By the time she got him across the threshold and into the house, her arms were shaking and her lungs burned. She kicked the door shut and let him drop. He landed on the rug with a wet thud. Keeper circled him, sniffing frantically. Clara leaned against the door, breathing hard, staring down at the stranger on her floor. Rain dripped from her hair. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, but from adrenaline and the sudden sharp awareness of what she'd just done. She'd let someone into her house. A man. A stranger. Someone who might be dangerous, might be dying, might be running from the law or a bad marriage or worse. "What the hell am I doing?" she muttered. But she was already moving. She couldn't stop now. She knelt beside him and rolled him onto his back. His face was pale beneath the mud and rain, sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, dark stubble. Younger than she'd expected, maybe 30. There was a gash above his left eyebrow, still bleeding sluggishly, and another wound she couldn't quite see beneath his torn coat. Clara pressed 2 fingers to his neck and found a pulse. Weak, but there. "All right," she said to no one. "All right, you're not dying in my house." She stood and grabbed a towel from the kitchen, then returned and started peeling off his coat. The fabric was heavy with water and mud, and it took her 3 tries to get it off his shoulders. Beneath it, his shirt was soaked through with blood. She cut it away with her sewing scissors, no time to be careful, and exposed the wound. A deep gash along his ribs, maybe 4 inches long. Not a knife, too ragged, something sharper and less precise. Barbed wire, maybe, or a tree branch. Clara grabbed another towel and pressed it against the wound, applying pressure the way her mother had taught her years ago. The bleeding slowed but didn't stop. She worked quickly after that. Boiled water on the stove, found the first aid kit she kept under the bathroom sink, cleaned the wound as best she could, stitched it closed with hands that refused to stop shaking, then bandaged it with gauze and medical tape. The cut on his forehead was easier, shallow, already clotting. She cleaned it and left it alone. By the time she finished, her back ached and her knees were sore from kneeling on the hard floor. The man hadn't stirred once. His breathing was still shallow, but more regular now. The color in his face was better. Clara sat back on her heels and studied him. He looked rough, even unconscious. His hands were calloused and scarred. His clothes, what was left of them, were worn but sturdy, the kind you bought for work, not fashion. A working man, maybe a farmer, maybe a drifter. Keeper lay down beside him, resting his head on the man's arm. "Traitor," Clara muttered. She stood, bones protesting, and carried the bloody towels to the sink. Outside, the storm raged on. The power was out now, just as she'd predicted. The house was dark except for the glow of the candles and the faint orange light from the stove. Clara looked at the man on her floor. This stranger she'd dragged in from the storm, stitched back together, and saved from bleeding out in the mud, and felt something cold settle in her chest. She didn't know his name, didn't know where he'd come from or what he was running from, didn't know if he'd wake up grateful or dangerous. All she knew was that she'd broken her one unbreakable rule. She'd let someone in, and now, whether she liked it or not, she'd have to deal with the consequences. 2 days earlier, Clara had always been good at being alone. Not lonely, there was a difference, though most people didn't seem to understand it. Lonely meant wanting something you didn't have. Alone meant choosing not to want it in the first place. She'd learned the distinction early. Her parents had shared a house for 30 years, raised 2 daughters, worked the same land, and slept in the same bed every night. And Clara couldn't remember a single moment when they'd seemed happy together. Just 2 people going through the motions, bound by duty and habit, and the farm that needed both of them to survive. Her older sister, Margaret, had called it making it work. Clara called it a slow death. When their father died, their mother lasted 6 months before the heart attack took her too. Margaret said it was grief. Clara thought it was relief. Margaret had married young and moved to the city. Clara stayed. Someone had to keep the land from going to seed, and it sure as hell wasn't going to be Margaret, who couldn't tell a fence post from a fence row and complained about the smell of manure every time she visited. That was 4 years ago. Margaret came back twice a year now, Christmas and the anniversary of their mother's death, and every visit ended the same way, with Margaret asking why Clara didn't sell the place and move somewhere with more opportunities, and Clara explaining patiently that she didn't want opportunities. She wanted this: the quiet, the routine, the satisfaction of work that left her too tired to think, and the certainty that no one could disappoint her if she didn't let them close enough to try. The morning before the storm, Clara woke at 5 like always. The cabin was cold. She dressed in the dark, jeans, flannel shirt, wool socks, boots, and went outside to check the animals. The sky was still black overhead, but the eastern horizon was starting to glow. Frost crunched under her boots, her breath plumed white. Keeper trotted along beside her, his tail wagging slowly. The chickens were already awake, clucking softly in their coop. Clara scattered feed, checked for eggs, and filled their water trough. 12 hens, all good layers. She'd lost 2 to a fox last spring, but the rest were survivors. Next were the goats, 3 of them, temperamental and loud, bleating at her the moment she appeared. She fed them, milked the 2 females, and checked their hooves for rot. All clear. The garden was mostly done for the season. She'd harvested the last of the squash and potatoes the week before, and the rows were turning brown and brittle. Only the root vegetables were left: carrots, turnips, beets, buried under straw to keep through the first frost. Clara walked the fence line, checking for breaks, found one post leaning badly, and made a mental note to fix it before winter. The list of things that needed fixing was always long. She didn't mind. It kept her busy. By the time she finished her rounds, the sun was up and her stomach was growling. She went inside, fried 2 eggs and a slice of ham, and ate standing at the counter while Keeper crunched his kibble in the corner. The rest of the day passed the way most days did: work, silence, routine. She chopped wood, patched a hole in the chicken coop where something had tried to dig under, cleaned the gutters, made a pot of soup for dinner, and ate it while reading a book she'd borrowed from the library in town. She didn't think about the storm coming, didn't think about strangers or choices or what might happen if her quiet, carefully controlled life got disrupted. She went to bed at 9, like always, and slept without dreaming. Now, the man woke on the second morning. Clara was at the stove frying eggs when she heard him move. A low groan, then the scrape of boots against wood. She turned, spatula in hand, and found him sitting up on the floor, one hand pressed to his bandaged ribs, his face pale and confused. Their eyes met. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. He looked worse in daylight. The bruises on his face had darkened overnight, purple and yellow blooms across his cheekbone and jaw. His dark hair was matted and tangled. His eyes, though, were sharp, alert, the green-gray of river stones. "Where am I?" His voice was rough, like he'd been shouting. "My house," Clara said. She didn't move from the stove. "Frost Hollow. You collapsed on my porch 2 nights ago." He frowned, gaze flicking around the cabin, taking in the sparse furniture, the wood stove, the shotgun still leaning by the door. Then his eyes dropped to his own chest, where the bandages were visible beneath the blanket she had draped over him. "You patched me up. You were bleeding. Why?" Clara blinked. "Why what? Why'd you help me?" It was a strange question, the kind that made her wonder what kind of life he'd lived, that he'd be surprised someone pulled him out of a storm. "You were dying on my porch," she said flatly. "Didn't seem right to leave you there." He studied her for another moment, then nodded slowly. "Thank you." Clara turned back to the stove. "You hungry?" "Starving." She cracked 2 more eggs into the pan and slid the spatula under them, flipping them with practiced efficiency. Behind her, she heard him shifting, trying to stand. There was a muffled curse, then the sound of him sitting back down. "Don't," Clara said without turning. "You've got 12 stitches in your side. You pop them. I'm not sewing you back up." "Noted." She plated the eggs, added 2 slices of bread and a piece of ham, and carried the plate over to him. He took it carefully, his hands shaking slightly, and nodded his thanks. Clara sat down at the table and watched him eat. He didn't shovel it down the way starving men usually did. He took slow, deliberate bites, as if he was trying to pace himself. Good instincts. Eating too fast after not eating for days could make you sick. When he finished, he set the plate aside and looked at her. What's your name? Clara? Clara what? Whitlock. He nodded. I'm Rowan. Rowan what? A pause. Hale. Clara didn't miss the hesitation. Where are you from, Rowan Hale? North of here. How far north? Far enough. She leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. You're on my property. I pulled you out of a storm, stitched you up, and fed you. I think I've earned more than vague answers. His jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he might refuse. Then he sighed. I was working a ranch up near Coldwater Ridge. Things went bad. I left. What kind of bad? The kind that's none of your business. Clara raised an eyebrow. You're in my house. And I'm grateful, but my past is my own. They stared at each other across the small room. Outside, the wind had finally died down, but the sky was still gray and heavy. More rain coming. Clara stood. Fine. Keep your secrets, but you're not staying here. Rowan's expression didn't change. Understood. Soon as you can walk, you're gone. Understood. Clara picked up his empty plate and carried it to the sink. Behind her, she heard him shifting again, testing his weight. This time, he managed to stand. She glanced over her shoulder and saw him swaying slightly, one hand braced against the wall. How far's the nearest town? He asked. Frost Hollow's 8 miles south. You won't make it on foot. I'll manage. Clara turned off the tap and dried her hands on a towel. There's a bus that comes through twice a week. Next one's Thursday. What's today? Tuesday. Rowan nodded slowly. All right. You can sleep in the barn until then. He looked at her, something unreadable in his expression. You sure you want me around that long? No, Clara said honestly. But I'm not sending you out in the rain with a hole in your side. You'd die, and I'd have to live with it. Fair enough. She crossed the room and opened the door. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of wet earth and pine. Barn's 50 yards east. There's blankets in the loft and a kerosene heater. Stay out of my way, and we won't have a problem. Rowan moved toward the door slowly, favoring his injured side. When he reached her, he paused. Thank you, he said again. Clara didn't answer. She just stepped aside and let him pass. She watched him cross the muddy yard toward the barn, his steps uneven but determined, and felt that cold weight settle in her chest again. 2 more days. That was all. Then he'd be gone, and her life would go back to normal. She told herself that over and over, like a prayer she didn't believe in. The first mistake. Rowan didn't stay out of her way. Clara woke the next morning to find him outside, splitting wood. She stood at the kitchen window with her coffee, watching him swing the axe. His movements were slow and careful, favoring his left side, pausing between swings to breathe, but efficient. Every log split clean, every piece stacked neatly. Keeper sat nearby, watching him with interest. Clara set down her coffee and went outside. What are you doing? Rowan paused mid-swing and looked at her. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold. You needed it done. That's not your concern. You saved my life. Least I can do is pull my weight while I'm here. Clara crossed her arms. I told you to stay in the barn. And I did. All night. But it's morning now, and I'm not good at sitting still. He swung the axe again. Another log split clean. Clara watched him for a moment, jaw tight. She should tell him to stop. Should make him go back to the barn and rest. But the woodpile had been on her list for weeks, and he was doing a better job than she would have done herself. You popped those stitches, she said finally. You're fixing them yourself. Rowan glanced at her, and for the first time since he'd woken up, something almost like a smile crossed his face. Deal. Clara turned and walked back to the house. He split wood for an hour, then started on the fence. Clara noticed when she went out to check the goats. The leaning post she'd been meaning to fix was straight now, braced with fresh wood and new nails. The broken rail beside it had been replaced. She found him in the barn, measuring a length of board. Where'd you get the lumber? Rowan looked up. Stacked behind the barn. Figured you wouldn't mind. I do mind. Why? Because I didn't ask you to do it. He set down the measuring tape and faced her fully. You need it done. I can do it. What's the problem? Clara's hands clenched into fists. The problem is that you're a stranger. I don't know you. I don't know why you're here or what you're running from. And now you're walking around my property like you own it, fixing things without asking, acting like... Like what? She stopped, bit down on the rest of the sentence. Like you belong here. Rowan held her gaze. I'm trying to help. I don't need help. Everyone needs help. Not me. The words came out sharper than she'd intended. Rowan didn't flinch, but something shifted in his expression, something that looked almost like understanding. All right, he said quietly. I'll ask next time. Clara turned and walked away before he could say anything else. That night, she found a stack of firewood on her porch, neatly split, perfectly sized for the stove. She stood in the doorway staring at it, feeling something hot and uncomfortable twist in her chest. Keeper nudged her hand. I know, Clara muttered. I know. She carried the wood inside piece by piece and told herself it didn't mean anything. Chipkam, the second mistake. Thursday came, and Rowan didn't leave. Clara woke that morning already tense. The bus was due at noon. She'd spent the last 2 days avoiding him as much as possible, working in the garden while he fixed the fence, eating her meals while he was in the barn, going to bed early so she wouldn't have to make conversation. It hadn't helped. He was everywhere. The wood he split, the fence he repaired, the gate that no longer squeaked. Evidence of him all over her property, like fingerprints she couldn't wipe away. She told herself it would end today. By this afternoon, he'd be gone, and she could go back to her quiet, controlled life. At 11:30, Clara put on her coat and walked out to the barn. Rowan was mucking out one of the stalls, a job she'd been putting off for weeks. He looked up when she entered, pitchfork in hand. Bus comes at noon, Clara said. Road's a 20-minute walk from here. You should get moving. Rowan nodded. All right. He set down the pitchfork, wiped his hands on his jeans, and grabbed his coat from where it hung on a nail. It was clean now. She'd washed it 2 days ago, though she couldn't say why. Some stupid instinct she couldn't shake. They walked to the road in silence. The morning was cold and clear, the sky a hard, bright blue. Their breath plumed white. Frost crunched under their boots. When they reached the end of the drive, Clara stopped. This is it. Rowan looked at her. I know. Bus will take you to Frost Hollow. From there, you can get a line to anywhere. I know. Clara shifted her weight. You got money? Rowan pulled a worn wallet from his pocket and showed her. 3 20s and some change. Enough to get him somewhere. Anywhere. Good, Clara said. Then, after a pause, where are you going? Haven't decided yet. You should decide soon. Yeah. They stood there in the cold, not quite looking at each other. Down the road, Clara could hear the faint rumble of the bus approaching. Thank you, Rowan said, for everything. Clara nodded stiffly. Don't mention it. The bus appeared around the bend, a faded blue vehicle with dirty windows and a wheezing engine. It slowed as it approached, brakes squealing. Rowan picked up the small pack he'd been carrying, his few belongings salvaged and cleaned, and moved toward the door. Clara turned to leave. Wait. She stopped. Rowan stood at the bus door, one hand on the rail, looking back at her. The driver waited, engine idling. That fence by the north pasture, Rowan said. The one near the creek. It's rotting at the base. You'll want to replace it before the ground freezes. Clara frowned. I know. And the barn roof. There's a loose shingle above the loft. It'll leak come winter. I know. The goats need their hooves trimmed. The brown one especially. I know. Rowan looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the bus. What are you doing? Clara asked. Staying. What? I'm staying. The bus driver leaned out the window. You getting on or not? Not, Rowan said. The driver shrugged and closed the door. The bus rumbled away down the road, leaving them standing in the cold. Clara stared at him. You can't stay. Why not? Because I don't know you. Because you're a stranger. Because you don't want help, Rowan finished. I remember. But here's the thing, Clara. You do need it. This place is falling apart, and you're doing everything you can to hold it together by yourself, but it's not enough. You know it's not enough. Get out. No. Clara's hands clenched into fists. This is my property. You can't just... I'm not asking to move in, Rowan interrupted. His voice was calm, steady. I'm asking to work. I'll stay in the barn. I'll earn my keep. And when you decide you don't need me anymore, I'll leave. But until then, let me help." "Why?" The word came out harder than she'd intended. "Why do you care?" Rowan's expression softened. "Because you pulled me out of that storm when you didn't have to. And because I've got nowhere else to be." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to tell him to walk down that road and find somewhere else to be a burden. But the words stuck in her throat. Because the truth was, he was helping. The wood was split. The fence was fixed. The barn was cleaner than it had been in months. And she was tired. So tired. Tired of doing everything alone. Tired of pretending she didn't need anyone. She looked at him, this stranger who'd fallen into her life like a curse or a gift she couldn't tell the difference between, and felt the first crack in the wall she'd built around herself. "1 month," she said finally. Rowan blinked. "What?" "You can stay 1 month. Through the first frost. Then you're gone." He nodded slowly. "All right. You stay in the barn. You work for your keep, and you stay out of my way." "Understood." Clara turned and started walking back to the house. Her heart was pounding. Her hands were shaking. She'd just made the second biggest mistake of her life, and she knew it. Behind her, she heard Rowan following. Keeper ran ahead, tail wagging, as if everything was fine, as if nothing had just changed forever. The first week passed in careful silence. Clara woke each morning before dawn and went through her routines as if nothing had changed. She fed the animals, collected eggs, checked fences, and avoided the barn except when absolutely necessary. Rowan kept to himself, working through a list of repairs that seemed to grow longer each day. They spoke only when they had to, brief exchanges about tools or supplies or which tasks needed doing next. It should have been easy. It should have felt like having a hired hand. Nothing more. It didn't. Clara felt his presence everywhere. In the freshly oiled gate hinges. In the neatly stacked hay bales. In the way Keeper started spending his afternoons in the barn instead of on the porch. Even when Rowan was out of sight, she could sense him, a weight in the air, a disruption in the careful equilibrium she'd spent years building. On the 8th day, she found him replacing boards on the chicken coop roof. "You don't need to do that," Clara called up to him. Rowan looked down from the ladder, hammer in hand. "It's leaking." "I know it's leaking. I was going to fix it." "When?" Clara's jaw tightened. "When I got to it." Which would be when, exactly? He gestured at the property around them. "You've got 20 different things that need fixing, and you're trying to do all of them alone. Something's going to slip through the cracks. That's my problem." "Not anymore." He turned back to his work, driving another nail home with 3 precise strikes. "You let me stay. That makes it my problem too." Clara wanted to argue, but the words felt hollow. He was right. She'd been prioritizing, putting out fires, letting smaller problems grow into bigger ones because there were only so many hours in a day and only 2 hands to do the work. She turned and walked back to the house, her boots squelching in the mud. Inside, she poured herself a cup of coffee and stood at the window watching him work. His movements were efficient, economical. No wasted motion. He'd tied his dark hair back with a piece of twine, and even from here she could see the concentration in his face, the way his brow furrowed slightly when he measured a board, the set of his jaw when he hammered. Keeper appeared at her side, whining softly. "I know," Clara muttered. "I don't trust him either." The dog wagged his tail. "Traitor." That night, Clara made stew, potatoes, carrots, onions, and the last of the beef from her freezer. She ladled herself a bowl and sat at the table with her book, trying to ignore the fact that there was enough for 2. She lasted 10 minutes before the guilt got to her. With a sigh, she filled a second bowl, grabbed a spoon and a piece of bread, and walked out to the barn. Rowan was sitting on a hay bale near the kerosene heater, mending a harness with waxed thread. He looked up when she entered, surprise flickering across his face. Clara held out the bowl. "You need to eat." He set down the harness and took the bowl carefully. "Thank you." She turned to leave. "Clara." She stopped but didn't turn around. "Why'd you really let me stay?" The question hung in the air between them. Clara's fingers curled into fists at her sides. "I told you. You needed help. The place needed work. That's not an answer." "But..." She turned then, meeting his eyes across the dim space. It's the only answer you're getting. Rowan studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded and picked up his spoon. Fair enough. Clara left before he could say anything else, her heart beating too fast for reasons she didn't want to examine. The second week brought the first hard frost. Clara woke to find the world transformed, every surface coated in white, the grass crunching underfoot, her breath clouding thick in the air. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees overnight. Winter was coming early this year. She dressed in layers and went out to break the ice on the water troughs. Rowan was already outside feeding the goats. He'd pulled on a heavy canvas coat she didn't recognize, probably something he'd had in his pack, and his breath steamed as he worked. Morning, he said when he saw her. Morning. Clara picked up the hammer she kept by the pump and struck the ice in the nearest trough. It shattered with a satisfying crack. Gonna be a cold one. Yeah. Rowan scattered another handful of feed. You got enough hay to last through winter? Should have. I bought extra last spring. And firewood? Clara hesitated. She had firewood, but not as much as she'd planned. Last winter had been mild, and she'd gotten complacent. This winter looked like it might be different. I'll manage, she said. Rowan gave her a look that said he didn't believe her, but he didn't push. Instead, he finished with the goats and moved on to the chickens, checking their coop for drafts. Clara watched him for a moment, then went inside to start breakfast. She was frying eggs when she heard the sound of an engine. She looked out the window and felt her stomach drop. Margaret's car was coming up the drive. No, Clara muttered. Not today. She considered pretending she wasn't home, but it was too late. Margaret had already parked and was climbing out of her sedan, wrapping a designer scarf around her neck. She looked impossibly out of place in her wool coat and leather boots, like a magazine cutout pasted onto the wrong background. Clara opened the door before Margaret could knock. What are you doing here? Margaret smiled brightly. Hello to you too, sis. I was in the area and thought I'd drop by. You're never in the area. Well, I am now. Can I come in? It's freezing out here. Clara stepped aside reluctantly. Margaret swept into the cabin, bringing with her a cloud of expensive perfume and urban judgment. You really need to do something about that porch, Margaret said, unwinding her scarf. The boards are rotting. I know. And the driveway's a mess. You should get it graded. I'll add it to the list. Margaret turned, taking in the sparse interior with the critical eye of someone who'd chosen city life and never looked back. You're still living like a hermit. I like it this way. Clara, you're 26 years old. You should be out meeting people, building a life. I have a life. This isn't a life. This is hiding. Before Clara could respond, the door opened and Rowan walked in, carrying an armload of firewood. He stopped when he saw Margaret, his expression carefully neutral. Margaret's eyes widened. Who's this? Clara's mind raced. He's Rowan, he said, setting the wood down by the stove. I work here. Work here? Margaret's gaze bounced between them. Since when do you have hired help? Since last week, Clara said tightly. And you didn't tell me? It didn't seem relevant. Margaret studied Rowan with open curiosity. Where are you from, Rowan? North of here? And before that? Various places. Margaret's smile sharpened. That's wonderfully vague. Rowan's expression didn't change. I should get back to work. He nodded to Clara and left without waiting for a response. The moment the door closed, Margaret rounded on Clara. Okay, what's going on? Nothing's going on. He needed work. I needed help. And you just happened to hire a strange man to live on your property? He's staying in the barn. Clara, Margaret's voice dropped, taking on the older sister tone that always made Clara's teeth clench. This isn't like you. You don't trust anyone. You barely let me visit. And now there's some drifter living 50 yards from your house? He's not a drifter. Then what is he? Clara didn't have an answer, or rather, she had too many answers, and none of them felt right. Margaret sighed and pulled out a chair. Look, I'm not trying to tell you how to live your life. Yes, you are. But this seems risky. You don't know him. You don't know where he came from or what he's running from. He's a good worker. That's not the point. Then what is the point, Margaret? Her sister looked at her with something that might have been concern or might have been pity. Clara couldn't tell the difference anymore. The point is that you've spent years building walls around yourself, and now you're letting someone in. I just want to make sure you know what you're doing. Clara crossed her arms. I know exactly what I'm doing. Do you? They stared at each other across the small kitchen. Outside, Clara could hear the rhythmic thud of an axe. Rowan, splitting more wood she hadn't asked him to split. Margaret stood. I should go. I've got a meeting in the city this afternoon. You drove 2 hours just to check on me. Someone has to. Margaret pulled on her coat and wrapped her scarf around her neck. At the door, she paused. Be careful, Clara. Please. I'm always careful. I know. That's what worries me. After Margaret left, Clara stood at the window and watched her car disappear down the drive. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, but from anger and something else she couldn't name. She heard the door open behind her. Your sister? Rowan asked. Unfortunately. She seems concerned about you. She's always concerned about me. It's her favorite hobby. Rowan moved to the stove and poured himself a cup of coffee. She's not wrong, though. Clara turned. About what? About you not knowing me. He met her eyes over the rim of his cup. You took a risk letting me stay. That's not nothing. Are you saying I shouldn't have? I'm saying I understand why she's worried. Clara studied him, this man who'd appeared in her life like a storm and refused to leave. He stood in her kitchen drinking coffee as if he belonged there, and the worst part was that it didn't feel wrong. It should have. Every instinct she'd honed over 26 years said it should feel wrong. It didn't. Tell me something true, Clara said suddenly. Rowan raised an eyebrow. What? Tell me one true thing about yourself. Not vague, not evasive, something real. He was quiet for a long moment, considering. Then he set down his cup. I had a brother, younger than me by 3 years. His name was Finn. Rowan's voice was steady, but something in his eyes had gone distant. He died 5 years ago. Logging accident up in the high country. I wasn't there when it happened. Clara felt something twist in her chest. I'm sorry. Me too. Rowan picked up his cup again. Your turn. What? You asked for something true. Fair's fair. Clara's throat tightened. She almost refused, almost told him it wasn't the same, that she hadn't agreed to any exchange. But there was something in his face. A challenge, maybe. Or an invitation. A door opening if she was brave enough to walk through it. I don't let people in, she said finally, because everyone who ever mattered to me left. My father died, then my mother. My sister moved away and only comes back when she feels guilty. And the people who stayed, my parents, they spent 30 years making each other miserable. So I decided I'd rather be alone than risk that. Rowan nodded slowly. Makes sense. Does it? Yeah. Loneliness is safer than disappointment. He drained the last of his coffee. I get it. Clara wanted to ask what he'd been disappointed by, what had driven him south through a storm with nothing but the clothes on his back. But before she could find the words, he'd already set down his cup and headed for the door. Thanks for breakfast, he said. I'll be working on the north fence if you need me. Then he was gone, and Clara was alone again in her kitchen, feeling like something had shifted between them that she couldn't quite name. The days grew shorter and colder. Clara settled into an uneasy routine with Rowan, not quite comfortable, but not unbearable either. They worked in parallel most days, their paths crossing at meals or when a task required 2 sets of hands. He fixed the barn roof. She harvested the last of the root vegetables. He reinforced the animal shelters for winter. She preserved what she could in jars and cold storage. They didn't talk much, but the silence between them started to feel less like avoidance and more like understanding. On a gray afternoon 2 weeks after Margaret's visit, Clara was in the garden pulling dead plants when Rowan appeared with a hammer and a box of nails. I'm going to build a windbreak, he said, for the chicken coop. Storm's coming tonight, and the forecast says it'll hit hard. Clara looked up at the sky. He was right. The clouds were dark and low, moving fast. Where'd you see a forecast? Radio in the barn. You should listen to it sometime. I know when storms are coming. Yeah, but wouldn't hurt to get the details. He started walking toward the coop. I'll need some of that scrap lumber, the pieces behind the barn. Clara almost told him no. almost insisted she could handle the windbreak herself, but her back was aching from an hour of pulling stubborn roots, and the temperature was dropping fast. Pride only got you so far when winter was breathing down your neck. Use whatever you need, she said. He nodded and kept walking. Clara went back to her work, but she couldn't focus. She found herself watching him instead. The way he measured twice before cutting, the way he tested each board for rot before using it. Careful. Methodical. Nothing wasted. By the time the first drops of rain started to fall, he'd built a solid barrier on the north side of the coop. The chickens huddled behind it, clucking their approval. That night, the storm hit like a freight train. Clara sat at her table with a book she wasn't reading, listening to the wind scream around the cabin. Rain hammered the roof. The windows rattled in their frames. The power had gone out an hour ago, and the only light came from the kerosene lamp on the table and the glow of the wood stove. She thought about Rowan in the barn. It was insulated, but not much. The heater would keep him from freezing, but it wouldn't be comfortable. She told herself it wasn't her problem. She lasted until midnight before the guilt won. Clara pulled on a rain slicker, grabbed a spare blanket and a thermos of hot coffee, and fought her way through the storm to the barn. Inside, Rowan was sitting on a hay bale near the heater, reading by the light of a battery-powered lantern. He looked up when she entered, water dripping from her coat. "What are you doing out here?" he asked. Clara thrust the blanket and thermos at him. "It's cold." He took them slowly, his expression unreadable. "You didn't have to do this." "I know. But you did anyway." "Don't read into it." Rowan's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "Wouldn't dream of it." Clara turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Clara." She looked back. "Thank you." She nodded once, then pushed back out into the storm. By the time she made it back to the cabin, she was soaked through and shivering. She stripped off her wet clothes, pulled on dry layers, and climbed into bed with her heart pounding too hard. She'd just crossed another line. She knew it. Bringing him food was one thing. Checking on him in a storm was something else. It was caring, and caring was dangerous. But as she lay in the dark listening to the wind, Clara couldn't make herself regret it. The storm cleared by morning, leaving the world scrubbed clean and bitterly cold. Clara woke to find ice coating every surface, the porch rail, the fence posts, the bare branches of the trees. The sun came out sharp and bright, turning everything to crystal. She stepped outside and found Rowan already working, chipping ice away from the water pump. He'd returned her blanket and thermos to the porch, neatly folded and clean. "Morning," he said without looking up. "Morning." They worked through the day in companionable silence, checking the animals, breaking ice, making sure nothing had been damaged by the storm. The windbreak he'd built had held perfectly. The chickens were dry and content. By afternoon, Clara's defenses had worn so thin she didn't notice when they finally cracked. She was in the barn, looking for a particular tool, when Rowan appeared in the doorway. "I need to make a run into town," he said. "Supplies. You need anything?" Clara blinked. "You're going to Frost Hollow? Unless there's somewhere closer. How are you getting there?" "Walking," I figured. "It's only 8 miles. That's 16 miles round trip." "I've walked farther." Clara stared at him. Then, against every instinct she'd cultivated for years, she said, "Take the truck." Rowan went very still. "What?" "The truck. It's in the shed. Keys are on a hook by the door." She turned back to the tool bench, her heart hammering. "Just don't wreck it." "Clara, and get diesel while you're there. Tank's probably half full." "You're trusting me with your truck." Apparently, she found the wrench she'd been looking for and held it up like a trophy. "Don't make me regret it." Rowan didn't move for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "I won't." "Good. Here." She pulled a 20 from her pocket and handed it to him. "Get supplies. Real food, not just canned beans. You don't have to consider it part of your wages." "I'm not taking wages." "Then consider it payment for all the work you've done that I didn't ask for." Clara met his eyes. "Just take the money, Rowan." He took it slowly, his calloused fingers brushing hers for just a second. "Thank you." Clara turned away before he could see the color rising in her cheeks. "Be back before dark." "Yes, ma'am." She listened to him leave, the sound of the shed door opening, the truck engine turning over, the crunch of tires on the frozen drive. Then silence. Clara stood in the barn holding a wrench she no longer needed and realized with a sinking feeling that she'd just given a stranger the keys to her only vehicle. Margaret would lose her mind if she knew, but Clara found she didn't care. Rowan came back 3 hours later with 2 bags of groceries, a full tank of diesel, and a bag of dog treats for Keeper. He unloaded everything in the kitchen while Clara tried not to look relieved that he'd actually returned. "Got bread, eggs, bacon, coffee, flour, sugar," he listed off. "Some fresh vegetables. They had a decent selection. And this." He pulled out a bag of peppermint candies. "Thought you might like them." Clara stared at the candies. They were her favorite. Had been since she was a kid. She hadn't mentioned that to anyone. "How did you—" "Saw the empty bag in the trash," Rowan said simply. "Figured you must like them." Something warm and terrifying unfurled in Clara's chest. "Thank you," she managed. "You're welcome." That night, Clara made a proper dinner for the first time in weeks. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans. She told herself it was because they had fresh groceries. Told herself it had nothing to do with wanting to share a meal with someone who'd noticed the small things about her. She set 2 plates on the table and called out to the barn. Rowan appeared a few minutes later, surprise clear on his face when he saw the spread. "What's this?" "Dinner. I can see that." "Are you going to stand there staring, or are you going to sit down before it gets cold?" Rowan sat. They ate in silence at first. The only sounds, the scrape of forks and the crackle of the fire. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that existed between people who didn't need to fill every moment with words. Halfway through the meal, Rowan spoke. "This is good. Really good." "Don't sound so surprised." "I'm not. Just, it's been a while since I had a home-cooked meal." Clara looked up. "How long have you been on the road?" "Year and a half, give or take." I said, "That's a long time." "Yeah." He cut another piece of chicken. Started to forget what it felt like. "What?" "Having a place to be." Clara's throat tightened. She knew exactly what he meant. She'd spent years building a place to be and making sure no one else could occupy it with her. But sitting here now, across from this man who'd stumbled into her life and refused to leave, she wondered if maybe she'd built the walls too high. "You've got a place," she said quietly. "For now, anyway." Rowan met her eyes across the table. "For now." After dinner, he helped her wash the dishes, something she'd never let anyone do before. They worked side by side at the sink, passing plates and cups in easy rhythm. When they finished, Rowan dried his hands and turned to her. "I should tell you something." Clara's stomach clenched. "What?" "That night I showed up here. The storm." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I wasn't just passing through, I was running." "From what?" "A man. Marcus Vane. He owned the ranch where I worked. Things went south between us. He's the kind of man who doesn't let people walk away." Clara felt cold. "Is he looking for you?" "Probably. Will he find you?" "I don't know." Rowan's jaw tightened. "I'm careful, and I've covered my tracks, but I needed you to know. In case." "In case what?" "In case he shows up here." Clara's hands curled into fists. "If he shows up here, he'll deal with me." Something flickered in Rowan's expression. Surprise, maybe, or gratitude. "Clara, I mean it. You're under my roof. That means something." "I'm in your barn." "Same thing." They stood there in the small kitchen, the distance between them suddenly feeling both too far and not far enough. Clara wanted to ask more questions about Marcus Vane, about what had happened, about what Rowan was so afraid of. But she could see the tension in his shoulders, the weight he'd been carrying. "Thank you," Rowan said finally, "for not telling me to leave." "I should," Clara said honestly. "I should tell you to pack your things and go. It would be smarter. But you won't." "No, I won't." "Why not?" Clara looked at him, really looked at him. At the man who'd fixed her fences and split her wood and noticed that she liked peppermint candies. The man who'd trusted her enough to tell her the truth when he could have just kept running. "Because I'm tired of being smart," she said. And before she could second-guess herself, before fear could drag her back behind her walls, Clara crossed the distance between them and wrapped her arms around him. Rowan went rigid with surprise. Then, slowly, his arms came up and held her back. They stood like that for a long moment. Two people who'd spent too long being careful, finally allowing themselves to be anything else. When Clara finally stepped back, her face was hot and her heart was racing. That was, she started. Yeah, Rowan said quietly. It was. Clara cleared her throat. You should get some rest. Yeah. He moved toward the door, then paused. Clara? What? This place you've built. This life. He looked back at her, something soft in his expression. It's not hiding. It's surviving. Don't let anyone tell you different. Then he was gone, leaving Clara alone in her kitchen with her heart beating too fast and the terrifying realization that she'd just let someone see her. Really see her. And the worst part was, she didn't want to take it back. That night, Clara lay awake listening to the wind and thinking about choices. Not the big ones. Those were easy to see coming, easy to brace for. It was the small ones that got you. The moment you opened a door instead of leaving someone in the cold. The moment you handed over truck keys. The moment you crossed a kitchen floor and let yourself hold on to another person like they might actually stay. She'd made all those choices in the span of 3 weeks, and now she was lying in the dark, wondering what the hell she'd been thinking. Except she knew exactly what she'd been thinking. Or rather, she'd stopped thinking altogether, and that was the problem. The wind rattled the shutters. Clara pulled the blanket up to her chin and tried to sleep, but her mind kept circling back to the weight of Rowan's arms around her, the way his heartbeat had felt steady and real beneath her cheek. She'd spent so long believing that walls kept you safe. But what if they just kept you small? Morning came cold and brittle. Clara forced herself out of bed and through her routines, determined to treat today like any other day. Feed the animals, check the water, pretend last night hadn't happened. She was halfway to the chicken coop when she saw him. Rowan stood by the north fence, his breath steaming in the cold air, staring at something in the distance. Even from here, Clara could see the tension in his shoulders. She changed direction and walked toward him. What's wrong? He didn't answer right away, just pointed toward the road. A dark sedan was parked at the end of the drive. Not moving, just sitting there with its engine running, exhaust curling white in the frozen air. Clara's stomach clenched. How long has it been there? 20 minutes? Maybe more. You think it's him? I don't know. They stood side by side, watching the car. Clara's hand drifted to her coat pocket, where she kept the small folding knife she used for cutting twine and opening feed bags. Not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. After another minute, the car's door opened. A man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing an expensive coat that had no business being in these hills. He looked up the drive toward the cabin, then got back in the car and drove away. Rowan let out a breath he'd been holding. That was him, Clara said. It wasn't a question. Yeah. What does he want? Me. Rowan's jaw was tight, and he wants people to know what happens when you walk away from him. Clara turned to face him fully. Tell me what happened, all of it. Rowan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze still fixed on the empty road. Then he spoke. I worked for Marcus Vane for 2 years. Good pay, steady work. I should have known it was too good to be true. He rubbed a hand across his face. Turns out he was running cattle through land that wasn't his, using my crew to do it. When I found out, I told him I was done. He said no one walks away from him. Said he'd make sure I never found work in 3 states. So you ran. So I ran. Rowan's voice was rough. Left in the middle of the night with what I could carry. He sent men after me. I lost them somewhere near Coldwater Ridge, but I knew it was only a matter of time before they picked up the trail again. Clara's hands curled into fists. Why didn't you tell me this before? Would it have changed anything? She wanted to say yes. Wanted to say she would have sent him away the moment she knew he was bringing trouble to her door. But standing here now, watching the fear and exhaustion etched into his face, she knew the truth. No, she said quietly. It wouldn't have. Rowan looked at her then, something complicated moving behind his eyes. I should go. If he knows I'm here, you're not going anywhere. Clara, I said you're not going. Her voice was hard as iron. That man drove onto my property to intimidate you, to make you run again. You think I'm going to let that happen? This isn't your fight. You're on my land. That makes it my fight. Clara stepped closer, meeting his eyes. Besides, you said you'd stay through the first frost. We haven't hit it yet. We hit it last week. That was just a warning frost. Doesn't count. Despite everything, Rowan's mouth twitched. You're making up rules. My property, my rules. They stood there in the cold, the morning sun slanting across the frost-covered ground, and Clara felt something shift between them again. Not a crack this time, something stronger, something that felt like trust being earned in both directions. All right, Rowan said finally, I'll stay. But if he comes back, we'll deal with it. We. Rowan nodded slowly. Then, so quietly she almost missed it, he said, Thank you. Clara turned and started walking back to the house before the tightness in her chest could turn into something embarrassing. Come on, we've got work to do. The next few days passed in careful watchfulness. Rowan worked closer to the cabin now, staying within sight. Clara caught herself checking the road more often than necessary, her shoulders tight every time she heard an engine in the distance. The dark sedan didn't come back, but its absence felt worse somehow, like waiting for thunder after you'd already seen the lightning. On the fourth day, Clara drove into Frost Hollow for supplies. She told Rowan she'd be back in 2 hours and left him with the shotgun. Still unloaded, but he knew where she kept the shells. The drive gave her time to think about Marcus Vane and what kind of man held grudges that deep, about Rowan and why she was willing to stand between him and danger, about herself and the walls she'd spent so long building, only to find they didn't protect her from anything that mattered. Frost Hollow was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, which meant Clara kept her head down and her shopping quick. She was loading bags into the truck when she heard a familiar voice. Clara Whitlock, as I live and breathe. She turned to find Daniel Morrison leaning against the side of the hardware store, arms crossed, wearing that lazy smile he'd been trying to charm her with since they were teenagers. Daniel? Haven't seen you in town for a while. Starting to think you'd turned into a complete hermit. Just busy. Yeah? He pushed off the wall and sauntered closer. Heard you got some help out at the place. A man. Clara's jaw tightened. Where'd you hear that? Small town. People talk. Daniel's smile widened. Margaret mentioned it when she was through here last week. Said you hired some drifter. He's not a drifter. What is he then? None of your business. Daniel held up his hands. Easy, just making conversation. Though I gotta say, Clara, it's not like you to take in strays. You sure you know what you're doing? Clara slammed the truck bed closed harder than necessary. I know exactly what I'm doing. Do you? Daniel's smile faded, and something almost like concern crossed his face. Look, I'm not trying to tell you how to live. But that guy, Rowan, right? He's got trouble written all over him, and you don't need that kind of trouble. Since when do you care what I need? Since always. Daniel stepped closer, dropping his voice. I've known you my whole life, Clara, and I know you think you're fine out there alone. But you don't have to be. You could— Don't, Clara cut him off. Don't finish that sentence. Why not? Because the answer's no. It's always been no. And it's always going to be no. Daniel's expression hardened. Because of him? Some stranger you've known for what, a month? Because I don't want it. Clara met his eyes steadily. I've never wanted it. Not with you. Not with anyone. Until now. The words hung between them like an accusation. Clara wanted to deny it, wanted to say Rowan was different, that this was just about helping someone who needed it. But the lie wouldn't come. Goodbye, Daniel. She climbed into the truck and drove away without looking back, her hands shaking on the wheel. By the time she got home, her anger had cooled into something quieter, but no less uncomfortable. She unloaded the supplies with Rowan's help, neither of them speaking much. But when they finished, he followed her into the cabin. What happened in town? Clara set a bag of flour on the counter harder than necessary. Nothing. Clara. She turned to face him. Ran into someone I knew. He had opinions about you being here. What kind of opinions? The kind that don't matter. Clara pulled off her coat and hung it on the hook. People talk. Small town. I should have expected it. Rowan leaned against the doorframe, studying her. Did he threaten you? No, just questioned my judgment. And he can go to hell. Clara yanked open a cupboard and started putting away canned goods with more force than required. I don't need anyone's permission to make my own decisions. No, Rowan said quietly. You don't. Something in his tone made her stop. She turned and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. What? Nothing, just... He paused. You keep surprising me. How? Most people would have sent me away by now, the moment they knew I came with complications. But you keep choosing to let me stay. Clara's throat tightened. Maybe I'm tired of being careful. Or maybe you're braver than you think you are. They looked at each other across the small kitchen, and Clara felt that dangerous warmth spreading through her chest again. She wanted to close the distance between them, wanted to feel his arms around her again, solid and real and proof that she wasn't as alone as she'd spent years convincing herself she needed to be. Instead, she turned back to the supplies. We should get dinner started. If Rowan was disappointed, he didn't show it. He just nodded and moved to help her. That night, they fell into an easy rhythm, Clara chopping vegetables while Rowan tended the stove, passing ingredients and utensils without needing to ask. It felt domestic in a way that should have terrified her. But standing here in the warm kitchen with snow starting to fall outside, Clara found she didn't mind. After they ate, Rowan pulled out a deck of cards he'd bought in town. You play poker? Clara raised an eyebrow. You want to gamble? We don't have to play for money, just for something to do. She considered refusing. But the alternative was sitting alone with her thoughts, and that seemed worse. Fine, but I'm warning you, I'm good. We'll see. They played until late, the kerosene lamp casting warm shadows across the table. Clara won the first 3 hands, then Rowan won the next 4. They traded victories back and forth, each one becoming more competitive as the night wore on. You're counting cards, Clara accused after he won again. You say that like it's cheating, isn't it? It's strategy. It's cheating. Rowan grinned, and the expression transformed his whole face, made him look younger, lighter, like the weight he'd been carrying had lifted for just a moment. Clara felt her breath catch. One more hand, she said. Winner takes all. What are we playing for? Bragging rights. That's it? Clara dealt the cards. What else do you want? Rowan picked up his hand, studied it, then looked at her. Truth. What? Winner gets to ask one question, any question, and the other person has to answer honestly. Clara's pulse kicked up. That's a terrible idea. You scared you'll lose? I'm not scared of anything. Then what's the problem? Clara looked at her cards. A decent hand, but not great. Then she looked at Rowan, at the challenge in his eyes, and made a decision that was probably stupid but felt inevitable. Fine, but the same rules apply to you. Deal. They played in tense silence, each one watching the other for tells. Clara drew 2 cards. Rowan drew 1. The lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. When they finally laid down their hands, Clara had a straight. Rowan had a flush. Damn, Clara muttered. Rowan gathered up the cards slowly, his expression thoughtful. Then he looked at her. Why did you really let me stay? Clara's stomach dropped. Of all the questions he could have asked, about her past, her parents, her sister, anything else, he'd gone straight for the one thing she hadn't fully admitted to herself. I told you, the place needed work. That's not an answer. It's the truth. It's not the whole truth. Clara's hands curled into fists on the table. You want the whole truth? Fine. I let you stay because when I pulled you out of that storm, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Like maybe I wasn't completely dead inside. Like maybe there was still some part of me that could care about another person without it destroying me. Her voice cracked. And that terrified me, but not as much as the thought of sending you away and going back to being completely alone. The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest and more vulnerable than Clara had been with anyone in years. Rowan didn't speak for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand. Thank you, he said quietly, for telling me. Clara wanted to pull away, wanted to retreat back behind her walls where it was safe and predictable and she didn't have to feel this much. But his hand was warm around hers, and something in his touch said he understood, that he knew what it cost her to say those words out loud, so she let him hold on. They sat like that until the lamp burned low, and the fire in the stove crumbled to embers. Then Rowan squeezed her hand once and let go. I should get some sleep. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. He stood and moved toward the door, then paused. Clara? Yeah. I'm not going anywhere, not unless you tell me to. Then he was gone, and Clara was alone again with her racing heart and the terrifying realization that she'd just told someone the truth about herself, and the sky hadn't fallen, the earth hadn't opened up and swallowed her whole. She'd just felt lighter. The snow started in earnest 2 days later. Not the gentle dusting they'd had before, but thick white curtains that turned the world into a blur. Clara woke to find 3 inches already on the ground and more falling fast. She dressed quickly and went outside. The cold hit her like a slap, but she pushed through it, checking on the animals. The chickens were huddled in their coop, the goats pressed together for warmth. Everything secure. Rowan was already clearing snow from the paths, his shovel cutting clean lines through the white. He looked up when he saw her. "Going to be a big one." "Yeah." Clara grabbed a second shovel from the barn. "We should bring in extra firewood." They worked together through the morning, hauling wood and breaking ice and making sure everything was battened down tight. By noon, the snow was 6 inches deep and showing no signs of stopping. Clara made hot soup for lunch and they ate it standing at the window, watching the storm. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Rowan said. "Dangerous." "That too." Clara glanced at him. "You ever see snow like this before?" "Yeah, up north. Winters there make this look like nothing." "Your brother, Finn, did he like the snow?" Rowan's expression softened. "Loved it. Used to say winter was the only time the world got quiet enough to think." "Sounds like someone I'd have liked." "You would have." Rowan set down his bowl. He was good at seeing the best in people, even when they couldn't see it themselves. Clara heard the subtext in his words, the suggestion that maybe Finn would have seen something good in her too, something worth knowing. The thought made her chest ache. "I wish I could have met him," she said quietly. "Me too." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the snow fall. Then Clara made a decision. "I want to show you something." She led him to the small room off the kitchen, the one she used for storage. Inside, stacked against the walls, were canvases, dozens of them, covered in dust. Rowan looked at her in surprise. "You paint?" "Used to." Clara pulled one canvas out and turned it to face him. It showed the cabin in summer, the garden in full bloom, light streaming through the trees. "Before my mother died. Haven't touched a brush in 4 years." Rowan studied the painting, his expression unreadable. Then he looked at her. "Why not?" "Because painting was something I did when I still believed things could be beautiful. After she died, it just felt like lying." "What changed?" Clara met his eyes. "Maybe I'm starting to think things can be beautiful again." The words settled between them, heavy with meaning. Rowan set down the painting carefully. "Can I see more?" So she showed him. Every canvas she'd stored away, landscapes and still lives and portraits of people who'd passed through Frost Hollow years ago. Rowan looked at each one like it mattered, like he was seeing not just the images, but the person who'd created them. When they finished, he turned to her. "You should start again." "I don't know if I can." "Why not?" "Because what if I was wrong? What if things aren't actually getting better? What if I'm just fooling myself?" Rowan stepped closer, his green-gray eyes serious. "What if you're not?" Clara wanted to argue, wanted to list all the reasons why hope was dangerous and faith was foolish, and letting yourself believe in anything was just setting yourself up for disappointment. But standing here with him, surrounded by the work she'd abandoned, and the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she could pick it up again, the arguments felt thin. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "That's all I'm asking." That night, the storm howled like something alive. Clara lay in bed listening to it, thinking about paintings and choices and the way Rowan had looked at her work like it was something precious. She thought about Finn, who'd loved winter because it was quiet, about Marcus Vane, who was probably out there somewhere waiting, about herself and all the years she'd spent being careful. Somewhere around midnight, she heard a sound that didn't belong to the storm. A crash, loud and close. Clara was out of bed in seconds, pulling on boots and grabbing the shotgun. She loaded it this time, 2 shells, hands steady despite her racing heart. The sound had come from the barn. She fought through the snow, her flashlight cutting through the white. The barn door was hanging open, banging in the wind. Inside, she could hear Keeper barking frantically. Clara raised the shotgun and stepped through the doorway. Rowan was on the ground, pinned beneath a man in a dark coat, Marcus Vane's man from the sedan. They were struggling, trading blows. Rowan trying to get leverage while the other man had size and position on his side. Clara didn't hesitate. She fired a shot into the ceiling. The sound was deafening. Both men froze. Keeper kept barking. "Get off him," Clara said, her voice steady as stone. "Now!" The man looked at her, then at the shotgun. He climbed off Rowan slowly, hands raised. Rowan got to his feet, blood running from a cut above his eye. He moved to stand beside Clara. "Who are you?" Clara demanded. The man smirked. "Just delivering a message." "What message?" "That Rowan Hale doesn't get to walk away. Not from Mr. Vane, not from his obligations." The man's gaze flicked to Rowan. "You got 1 week to come back. After that, Mr. Vane stops being patient." "He's not going back," Clara said. The man laughed. "That your decision to make, sweetheart?" "It's mine," Rowan said quietly. "And she's right. I'm not going back." "Then you're stupider than I thought." The man started backing toward the door. 1 week. After that, Mr. Vane will come himself, and he won't be as nice as me." Clara kept the shotgun trained on him until he disappeared into the storm. Then she lowered it, her hands finally starting to shake. Rowan touched her shoulder gently. "You okay?" "Am I okay?" "You're the one bleeding." "It's nothing. It's not nothing." Clara grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the house. "Come on." Inside, she made him sit at the table while she got the first aid kit. His eye was already swelling, the cut deep enough to need stitches. She cleaned it carefully, her hands steadier now that she had something to do. "How did he get in?" she asked. "Broke the lock on the barn door. I woke up to him standing over me." "He could have killed you." "But he didn't. He was just sending a message, like he said." Clara pressed a bandage over the wound, harder than necessary. 1 week. "Yeah." "What are you going to do?" Rowan caught her hand, stopping her from fussing with the bandage. "I'm going to stay. And when Marcus Vane comes, we're going to face him together." "Rowan, you stood up for me tonight. You could have stayed in the house. Could have let him do whatever he came to do. But you came out into that storm with a loaded gun because you weren't going to let anyone hurt me on your property." He squeezed her hand. "I'm not running anymore, Clara. Not from him. Not from this." Clara's throat was tight. "He could hurt you. He could hurt both of us." "I know. And you're still staying?" "I'm still staying." They looked at each other across the small table, blood on Rowan's face and fear in Clara's chest, and something passed between them that felt like a promise neither of them had to speak out loud. Clara pulled her hand free and finished bandaging the cut. When she was done, Rowan stood. "I should get back to the barn." "No," he blinked. "What?" "You're not sleeping in the barn tonight. You're staying here." "Clara," that man broke in once. "He could come back, and I'm not letting you face that alone." She crossed her arms. "You can have the couch. It's not comfortable, but it's better than nothing." Rowan looked like he wanted to argue. Then he nodded. "All right." Clara fetched blankets and a pillow while Rowan banked the fire. They moved around each other in practiced rhythm, familiar now with the rhythms of the space and each other. When everything was ready, Clara paused at the door to her room. "Thank you," she said, "for not leaving." "Thank you," Rowan replied, "for not making me." Clara closed the door and climbed into bed, but sleep was a long time coming. Outside, the storm raged on. In the next room, Rowan was settling onto the couch, close enough that she could hear him breathing. And for the first time in years, Clara realized she wasn't afraid of the dark. Clara woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of someone moving in her kitchen. For one disoriented moment, she forgot where she was, forgot everything that had happened. Then memory crashed back. The storm, the intruder, Rowan bleeding on the barn floor, the promise she'd made to stand beside him. She dressed quickly and opened her bedroom door to find Rowan at the stove, scrambling eggs with one hand while he held a mug of coffee in the other. The bruise around his eye had darkened overnight, a purple-black bloom that made her stomach clench. "You should be resting," she said. He glanced over his shoulder. "I don't need rest. I need to do something." "Like cook my breakfast?" "Like earn my keep." He plated the eggs and set them on the table. "You saved my life last night. Again. Least I can do is make sure you eat." Clara wanted to argue, but the food smelled good and her stomach was growling. She sat down and picked up her fork. They ate in silence, broken only by the clink of utensils and the crackle of the fire. Outside, the storm had finally stopped. Sunlight streamed through the windows, turning the snow-covered world into something almost painfully bright. "We need a plan," Rowan said finally. "I know. He'll come back, Vane. And next time he won't send just one man." Clara set down her fork. "So what do you want to do?" "I don't know." Rowan rubbed a hand across his face, wincing when he touched the bruise. "Part of me says we should go to the sheriff. But Vane's got connections, money. He'll have a story ready that makes me look like the criminal." "What did you actually do, besides refuse to help him steal?" "I saw things, records, proof of what he was doing. I made the mistake of telling him I was keeping copies as insurance." Rowan's mouth twisted. "That's when he decided I was a problem that needed eliminating." "Do you still have the records?" "Yeah. Hidden. Not here, but somewhere I can get to them if I need to." Clara's mind was working through possibilities, weighing options. "We could leave, both of us. Pack up and disappear before he comes back." "You'd do that? Leave this place?" The question hit harder than it should have. Clara looked around the cabin, the home she'd built, the life she'd carved out for herself through sheer stubborn will. The thought of abandoning it made her chest ache. "I'd consider it," she said carefully, "if it meant keeping you safe." Rowan shook his head. "I'm not letting you give up your home because of me." "Then what?" "Then we stand our ground. We prepare. And when Vane comes, we make sure he knows that coming after me means going through both of us." Clara met his eyes across the table. "You realize how crazy that sounds?" "Yeah. He could have us killed." "He could." "And you still want to stay?" Rowan reached across the table and took her hand. "I've been running for a year and a half. I'm tired, Clara, tired of looking over my shoulder, tired of living like I don't deserve to have a place to be. And I found that place here, with you. I'm not giving it up without a fight." Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to tell him he was being stupid, that no place was worth dying for, that survival meant knowing when to cut your losses and run. But looking at him now, at the determination in his bruised face, at the way he held her hand like it was something precious, she realized he wasn't just talking about the land, he was talking about her. "All right," she said quietly. "We stay, we fight, but we do it smart." "Agreed." "First thing we do is call Margaret." Rowan blinked. "Your sister?" "She works with lawyers, corporate types, but they'll know who to contact if things go bad. We need someone on our side who has connections." Clara squeezed his hand once and let go. "Second thing is we secure the property. Check every lock, every window, set up a rotation so one of us is always awake." "And third?" "Third, you tell me exactly what's in those records, because if we're going to use them, I need to know what we're dealing with." Rowan nodded slowly. "Fair enough." They spent the rest of the morning turning Clara's home into something more defensible. Rowan reinforced the door hinges and installed a deadbolt Clara had bought years ago but never gotten around to using. Clara checked every window latch and made sure the shotgun was cleaned and loaded, with extra shells in easy reach. They moved the most valuable supplies, water, food, first aid, into the cabin where they could access them without going outside. By afternoon, Clara's hands were raw and her back ached, but the cabin felt more secure. She stood in the kitchen drinking water and watching Rowan nail boards across the window that faced the road, not blocking it completely, but making it harder for anyone to break through. "Tell me about the records," she said. Rowan paused, hammer in hand. "What do you want to know?" "Everything." He climbed down from the chair he'd been standing on and came to lean against the counter beside her. Vane was running two operations, the legal one, his ranch, which was legitimate enough, and the illegal one, using his cattle and his crew to move livestock through federal land without permits. He was selling to buyers across state lines, pocketing the profit, and avoiding all the fees and regulations that legitimate ranchers have to deal with. "How much money are we talking about?" "Hundreds of thousands, maybe more. I didn't get into his full accounting, but what I saw was enough to put him away for years if the right people got their hands on it." Clara whistled low. "And he knows you have proof of this?" "He knows I saw something. I'm not sure he knows exactly what I copied or where I put it." "Where did you put it?" "Safety deposit box. 3 towns over from Coldwater Ridge. It's under a false name, and only I know where the key is. Can Vane trace it? Not unless he's a hell of a lot smarter than I think he is. Clara considered this. So we have leverage. If he comes after us, we threaten to release the records. That's the plan. But Vane's not the kind of man who responds well to threats. Neither am I. Rowan looked at her, and something in his expression softened. No, you're not. That evening, Clara called Margaret. Her sister answered on the 3rd ring, sounding harried. Clara, is everything okay? You never call. I need help. There was a pause, then Margaret's voice sharpened. What kind of help? Clara explained the situation as concisely as she could. Rowan's past, Marcus Vane, the intruder in the barn. When she finished, Margaret was quiet for a long moment. You fired a gun at a man in your barn. I fired it at the ceiling. That's not much better. Margaret took a breath. Okay. First thing, you need to file a police report tonight. Document everything. Rowan's worried the sheriff won't believe us. Then you make him believe you. Get it on record that someone broke into your property and assaulted your hired hand. That creates a paper trail. If anything else happens, you'll have documentation. Clara hadn't thought of that. What else? Get a lawyer, a good one. I'll send you names of people who specialize in this kind of thing. Criminal defense, maybe someone with experience in agricultural law since that's Vane's background. You need someone who can protect you if this goes to court. We don't have money for lawyers, Margaret. I have money. I'll cover it. Clara's chest tightened. You don't have to do that. Yes, I do. You're my sister. Margaret's voice cracked slightly. And despite what you think, I do care about you. So let me help, please. Clara closed her eyes. Okay. Thank you. Is Rowan there? Can I talk to him? Clara handed the phone to Rowan, who took it warily. She watched his face as he spoke to Margaret, answering her sharp questions with careful honesty. After a few minutes, he handed the phone back. She wants to talk to you again. Clara put the phone to her ear. Yeah? He seems decent, Margaret said, for a man who's brought a crime boss down on your head. He didn't mean to. I know, but Clara? Margaret's voice went serious. If this gets worse, if you're in actual danger, I want you to leave. Promise me. Don't be stubborn. Don't try to tough it out. Just get out and call me. I promise. I don't believe you, but I had to try. Margaret sighed. I love you, you know, even when you're being impossibly difficult. I love you too, Clara said quietly. After she hung up, she found Rowan standing at the window, staring out at the darkening sky. Your sister's intense, he said. She's a lawyer. It's her job to be intense. She cares about you. I know. Rowan turned to face her. You're lucky to have family like that. Clara thought about her parents, about the cold silences and loveless routine that had defined her childhood. Then she thought about Margaret, who'd chosen a different path but never stopped trying to pull Clara along with her. Yeah, she said. I guess I am. That night, they took turns keeping watch. Clara took the first shift, sitting at the kitchen table with the shotgun across her lap and a mug of coffee growing cold beside her. The cabin was quiet except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall and the occasional creak of the house settling. Around midnight, Rowan emerged from the bedroom. She'd insisted he take the bed while she took watch. You should be sleeping, Clara said. Can't. He poured himself coffee and sat down across from her. Keep thinking about what happens when the week's up. We'll handle it. You keep saying that. Because it's true. Rowan studied her in the lamplight. Why are you doing this, Clara? Really, you could tell me to leave right now and you'd be safer for it. Clara set down her mug carefully. You want the truth? Always. When you showed up here, I was barely living. I was surviving, going through the motions, telling myself I was fine. But I wasn't fine. I was dying inside, one quiet day at a time. And then you crashed into my life and refused to leave, and suddenly I had a reason to get up in the morning that wasn't just duty. She met his eyes. You made me feel alive again, and I'm not giving that up. Not for Marcus Vane, not for anyone. Rowan's expression was unreadable. Then he reached across the table and cupped her face in his hand, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. You're the bravest person I've ever met, he said quietly. Clara's breath caught. I'm not brave. I'm terrified. Bravery isn't not being scared. It's being scared and doing it anyway. Before she could respond, before she could talk herself out of it, Clara leaned forward and kissed him. For a heartbeat, Rowan went still. Then his hand slid into her hair and he kissed her back, gentle and fierce all at once. Clara felt herself melting into it, into him, into the warmth and solidity and rightness of it. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. I've wanted to do that for weeks, Rowan admitted. Why didn't you? Because you deserve to make the choice, not me. Clara's chest ached. I'm choosing you. You know that, right? I was hoping. She kissed him again, slower this time, tasting coffee and possibility. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his. This is probably a terrible idea, she murmured. Probably. We're in the middle of a crisis. We are. And you're still technically my employee. Technically. Clara pulled back just enough to look him in the eye. I don't care. Rowan smiled. A real smile, the kind that transformed his whole face. Neither do I. They stayed up the rest of the night talking. Not about Marcus Vane, or threats, or danger, but about everything else. Rowan told her about growing up in the mountains, about learning to track deer with his father, about the summer he and Finn built a treehouse that collapsed the first time it rained. Clara told him about learning to paint, about the year she raised a baby goat by hand after its mother rejected it, about the time she'd tried to leave Frost Hollow and made it as far as the city limits before turning back. As dawn broke, painting the snow-covered world in shades of pink and gold, Clara realized she'd told him more about herself in one night than she'd told anyone in years. You should get some sleep, Rowan said, even though he looked as reluctant to move as she felt. So should you. Someone needs to keep watch. We both need rest. Clara stood and held out her hand. Come on. He took her hand and let her lead him to the bedroom. They lay down on top of the blankets, fully clothed, not quite touching, but close enough that Clara could feel his warmth. This okay? Rowan asked. Yeah. Clara closed her eyes and let herself drift, feeling safer than she had in weeks despite everything that was coming. The week passed in a strange blend of normal and not normal. Clara and Rowan fell into routines, taking care of the animals, chopping wood, preparing meals. But underneath it all was the constant awareness that time was running out, that Marcus Vane was coming, and when he did, everything would change. On the 6th day, Clara went back to the storage room and pulled out her painting supplies. Her hands shook as she set up the easel, mixing colors she hadn't touched in 4 years. Rowan watched from the doorway, not speaking, just being present. She started with simple strokes. The curve of a hill, the line of a fence, the shape of a figure standing in snow. It felt like learning to breathe again after years underwater. It's good, Rowan said when she finally stepped back. It's rough. It's honest. Clara looked at the canvas, at the rough approximation of her property, of her life, of the man who'd become part of both. It wasn't beautiful yet, but it was real. Thank you, she said, for pushing me to try again. Thank you for letting me stay long enough to see it. On the 7th day, Clara woke to the sound of engines. She was out of bed instantly, pulling on boots and grabbing the shotgun. Rowan was already at the window, his face grim. 3 vehicles, he said, coming up the drive. Clara's stomach dropped. It's him. Yeah. They stood side by side, watching the vehicles approach. 2 trucks and a sedan, all dark, all expensive. They stopped 50 yards from the cabin, engines idling. The sedan's door opened, and a man stepped out. Even from here, Clara could see he was different from the others. Older, well-dressed, moving with the kind of confidence that came from always getting what you wanted. Marcus Vane. Stay inside, Rowan said. Like hell. Clara. We said we'd face this together. That means together. Rowan looked at her, conflict clear in his face. Then he nodded. They walked out onto the porch side by side, Clara with the shotgun, Rowan with nothing but his presence. Keeper stayed close to Clara's leg, growling low. Marcus Vane smiled and started walking toward them. He moved like he owned the ground beneath his feet, like he owned everything and everyone he looked at. He stopped at the base of the porch steps. Rowan Hale, you're a hard man to track down. I wasn't trying to be found, Rowan said evenly. Clearly. Vane's gaze shifted to Clara, assessing. And you must be the woman foolish enough to harbor a thief. He's not a thief, Clara said. And this is my property. You're trespassing. Vane laughed. Your property? That's charming. Do you know what your friend here stole from me, Miss Whitlock? And he didn't steal anything. He documented your crimes. Vane's smile faded. Is that what he told you? That's what he told me. And I believe him. Then you're as stupid as he is. Vane climbed one step and Clara raised the shotgun. He stopped, hands raised in mock surrender. Easy now. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to make a deal. I'm not interested in deals, Rowan said. You should be, because the alternative is that I make your life very, very difficult, and not just yours. Vane's eyes flicked to Clara. Hers too. It would be a shame if something happened to this lovely property. Fires are so common in the winter. Clara's finger tightened on the trigger. Touch my property, and you won't make it off this porch. Threatening me with a weapon. That's assault, Miss Whitlock. I could have you arrested. I'm defending my home from an intruder. That's legal. Clara's voice was steady as stone. And you should know, everything Rowan's told me about you, I've told my sister. She's a lawyer. She knows your name, knows what you've done, and if anything happens to either of us, she'll make sure those records Rowan has end up in the right hands. Vane's expression darkened. You're bluffing. Try me. They stared at each other across the frozen morning air, and Clara felt her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. But she didn't lower the gun, didn't blink, didn't back down. Finally, Vane stepped back. You've made a mistake, Miss Whitlock. Both of you. But I'm a patient man. I can wait. He turned to Rowan. When you change your mind, and you will, you know how to find me. I won't be looking. Vane smiled coldly. We'll see. He walked back to his sedan, climbed in, and drove away. The trucks followed, leaving tracks in the snow that slowly filled with fresh powder. Clara and Rowan stood on the porch until the engines faded to nothing. Then Clara lowered the shotgun, her hand shaking so hard she nearly dropped it. We did it, she said. We actually did it. Rowan pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. You were incredible. I was terrified. You were both. They stood like that for a long time, the cold seeping through their clothes, both of them trembling with adrenaline and relief and the sheer disbelief of still being alive. When they finally went inside, Clara called Margaret and told her what had happened. Her sister listened without interrupting, then let out a long breath. I'm coming up there. You don't have to. I'm coming. I'll be there tomorrow. And I'm bringing a lawyer with me, a real one, who specializes in this kind of thing. We're going to make sure Vane can't touch you. Margaret, don't argue with me, Clara. Just this once. Let someone help you. Clara closed her eyes. Okay. Okay. Margaret's voice softened. I'm proud of you, you know. What you did today. That took guts. Or stupidity. Sometimes they're the same thing. After Clara hung up, she found Rowan in the kitchen making coffee with hands that were still shaking. Margaret's coming tomorrow, she said. Good. She's bringing a lawyer. Even better. Clara moved to stand beside him. You think Vane will actually leave us alone? I don't know, but I think we bought ourselves time, and time's all we need to figure out the next step. What is the next step? Rowan set down the coffee pot and turned to face her. We live. We keep working this land. We make something good out of all this mess. He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. We build a life, together, if that's what you want. Clara's throat was tight. She thought about all the years she'd spent alone, convincing herself she preferred it that way. All the walls she'd built and the people she'd kept at arm's length. All the mornings she'd woken up feeling like she was slowly disappearing. And then she thought about Rowan, about the way he'd refused to leave even when she'd given him every reason to, about the way he saw her, really saw her, and stayed anyway. That's what I want, she said, more than anything. Rowan kissed her, soft and sure, and Clara felt something inside her that had been frozen for years finally begin to thaw. They spent the rest of the day like it was any other, feeding animals, chopping wood, making dinner. But everything felt different, lighter, like they'd crossed some invisible line and left the worst of it behind. That night, Clara pulled out her painting supplies again. This time, she didn't paint the landscape or the cabin or any of the safe, distant things she'd always hidden behind. She painted Rowan, the strong lines of his face, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the scar above his eyebrow that she'd stitched herself. "You're staring at me," he said from where he sat reading. "I'm painting you. That's worse. Consider it payback for all the work you've done around here without asking." Rowan set down his book and came to stand behind her, looking at the canvas. "Is that really how you see me?" "Yeah. I look... what?" "Happy," he said softly. "I look happy." Clara studied the painting with fresh eyes and realized he was right. She'd captured something in his expression that she'd never consciously noticed, a kind of peace that hadn't been there when he first arrived. "You are happy," she said. "Aren't you?" Rowan wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Yeah, I really am." Clara leaned back into him, brush still in hand, paint drying on the canvas. Outside, snow began to fall again. Not the violent storm kind, but soft and gentle, covering everything in clean white. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Clara looked at her life and didn't see survival. She saw possibility. She saw a future. She saw home. And standing in her warm cabin with Rowan's arms around her and paint on her hands and the smell of coffee filling the air, Clara realized something that would have terrified her 6 weeks ago, but now felt like the most natural thing in the world. She wasn't alone anymore. And she never wanted to be again. Margaret arrived the next afternoon in a rental SUV with a man in an expensive suit and the kind of briefcase that meant serious business. Clara watched from the porch as they navigated the snow-covered drive, her sister's face visible through the windshield, determined, worried, and trying hard not to show either. "That's quite an entrance," Rowan murmured beside her. "That's Margaret." The SUV stopped and Margaret climbed out, immediately slipping on the ice before catching herself on the door. She looked up at Clara with an expression that was half exasperation, half relief. "You could have warned me about the driveway." "I could have," Clara agreed, "but where's the fun in that?" Margaret's companion emerged more carefully, testing each step. He was younger than Clara expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes and the kind of presence that suggested he was used to winning arguments. "Clara Whitlock?" He extended a hand. "James Chen. Your sister hired me to help with your situation." Clara shook his hand, noting the firm grip. "You drove all the way from the city?" "It seemed prudent to meet in person. What you're dealing with requires more than phone consultations." They went inside, and Clara made coffee while Margaret and James settled at the table. Rowan stood near the stove, quiet but watchful. Keeper immediately went to Margaret, who scratched behind his ears absently while studying the cabin with barely concealed concern. "So," James said, pulling out a legal pad, "tell me everything." Clara and Rowan took turns explaining. The night Rowan arrived, Marcus Vane's threats, the intruder in the barn, yesterday's confrontation. James took notes in neat, precise handwriting, occasionally asking clarifying questions that made Clara realize just how much trouble they might actually be in. When they finished, James set down his pen and looked at them both. "First things first, we need those records, the ones you mentioned about Vane's illegal operations. Without physical evidence, this becomes he said, she said, and Vane has resources we don't." "I can get them," Rowan said. "But the bank's 3 hours north, and I'd have to go alone. It's under a false name. If anyone else shows up, they won't release the box." "How soon can you leave?" "Tomorrow morning. I'll be back by evening." James nodded. "Once we have the records, we take them to the federal authorities. What Vane's doing, transporting livestock across state lines without proper permits, evading taxes, that's federal jurisdiction. The local sheriff might be in Vane's pocket, but federal agents won't be." "And in the meantime?" Clara asked. "In the meantime, you file a restraining order against Vane. Document everything. The confrontation on your property, the assault in the barn, all of it. Create a paper trail." James's expression was grim. "I won't lie to you. This is going to get worse before it gets better. Vane doesn't strike me as a man who walks away easily." "He's not," Rowan said quietly. Margaret reached across the table and took Clara's hand. "You could still leave, both of you. Come stay with me in the city until this blows over." Clara looked at her sister. At the genuine concern in her eyes, the fear she was trying to hide. Then she looked around the cabin at the life she'd built, at Rowan standing steady and solid by the stove. "No," she said. "This is my home. I'm not letting him take it from me." Margaret squeezed her hand. "I knew you'd say that, but I had to ask." They spent the rest of the afternoon going over details, preparing documentation, building a case. James was thorough to the point of being exhausting, but Clara found herself grateful for it. He treated their situation like it mattered, like they mattered, and that alone made her feel less alone. As the sun began to set, Margaret pulled Clara aside while James and Rowan discussed logistics. "You love him," Margaret said. It wasn't a question. Clara didn't bother denying it. "Yeah." "When did that happen?" "I don't know. Somewhere between the moment I pulled him out of the storm and the moment I realized I didn't want him to leave." Margaret studied her face, then smiled. A real smile, not the worried one she'd been wearing all day. "You look different. Lighter, somehow." "I feel different." "Good." Margaret pulled her into a hug, fierce and unexpected. "You deserve to be happy, Clara. I know you don't believe that, but you do. And if Rowan makes you happy, then I'm on his side." Clara's throat tightened. "Even though he brought all this trouble?" "Especially because of that. Because you chose to stand beside him anyway. That's not the sister I left here 4 years ago. That's someone braver." When they pulled apart, Clara's eyes were wet. "Thank you for coming." "Always," Margaret said. "That's what sisters do." That night, after Margaret and James had driven back to town to check into a hotel, Clara and Rowan sat by the fire. The cabin felt too quiet after all the activity, but it was a comfortable quiet, the kind that existed between people who didn't need to fill every silence with words. "You nervous about tomorrow?" Clara asked. "A little." Rowan stared into the flames. "Mostly, I'm worried about leaving you alone." "I'll be fine. Margaret and James are just 20 minutes away if I need them." "I know, but still." Clara moved closer, tucking herself against his side. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders automatically, like they'd been doing this for years instead of days. "Tell me something," she said. "When you were running, before you ended up here, what kept you going?" Rowan was quiet for a moment. "Honestly? Nothing. I was just moving because stopping felt like giving up. I didn't have a destination, didn't have a plan. I was just surviving, day to day, telling myself it had to get better eventually. And then you collapsed on my porch. And then I collapsed on your porch. Worst and best thing that ever happened to me." Clara tilted her head to look up at him. "How is it the best thing?" "Because I found you." He said it simply, like it was the most obvious truth in the world. "Because for the first time in a year and a half, I had a reason to stop running." Clara's chest ached in the best possible way. "I'm glad you stopped." "Me too." They stayed by the fire until the logs burned down to embers, talking about small things and big things and everything in between. Rowan told her about the places he'd been, the jobs he'd worked, the people he'd met in his months on the road. Clara told him about her paintings, about the year she spent trying to save her mother, about the moment she realized some people couldn't be saved, no matter how hard you tried. When they finally went to bed, they lay facing each other in the darkness, hands clasped between them. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Rowan said quietly, "I want you to know something." "What?" "You changed my life. You gave me a home when I had nothing. You stood up for me when you had every reason to turn me away, and I will spend the rest of my life being grateful for that." Clara's throat was too tight to speak. Instead, she pulled him closer and kissed him, trying to pour everything she felt into that single gesture. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his. "Come back to me," she whispered. "Always." Rowan left before dawn while the world was still dark and frozen. Clara stood on the porch watching his taillights disappear down the drive, keep her pressed against her leg, and tried not to think about all the things that could go wrong. She threw herself into work to keep her mind occupied, fed the animals, chopped wood, cleaned the barn. By mid-morning, her back was aching and her hands were raw, but at least she wasn't thinking about Rowan driving through unfamiliar territory with evidence that could put a dangerous man behind bars. Margaret called around noon to check in. "Any word?" "Not yet. He said he'd call when he got there." "And you're okay? You sound stressed." I'm fine, just worried. That's allowed, you know. Worrying about someone you love. It doesn't make you weak. Clara leaned against the counter, phone pressed to her ear. I know, it's just new. It gets easier, or maybe it doesn't, but it gets more familiar, at least. Margaret paused. James and I are going to stay in town a few more days, just until this is resolved. Is that okay? You don't have to do that. I want to. Besides, James is already drafting the restraining order. Might as well see it through. After they hung up, Clara made herself eat lunch even though she wasn't hungry. Then she went to the storage room and pulled out a fresh canvas. She didn't know what she was going to paint, but her hands needed something to do. She started with broad strokes, the horizon line, the shape of the mountains in the distance. Then details emerged without her consciously choosing them. The cabin, the barn, the fence Rowan had repaired, a figure in the foreground standing with a shovel, looking out at the land like he owned it not through possession, but through care. Clara was so focused on the painting that she almost missed the sound of an engine. But Keeper heard it. He started barking, running to the door, and Clara's stomach dropped. She set down her brush and grabbed the shotgun, moving to the window. A truck was coming up the drive, not Rowan's truck. This one was dark and heavy, with mud-splattered sides and tinted windows. Clara's pulse kicked into overdrive. She checked that the shotgun was loaded, then positioned herself by the door where she could see out, but had cover. The truck stopped in front of the cabin. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out, the same one who'd broken into her barn. He grinned when he saw her in the window. Miss Whitlock, we need to talk. Clara opened the door, but kept the shotgun raised. Get off my property. Can't do that. Mr. Vane sent me with a message. I'm not interested. You'll want to hear this one. The man took a step closer, and Clara raised the shotgun higher. He stopped, hands raised. Easy. I'm just here to deliver information. Your boyfriend took something that doesn't belong to him. Mr. Vane wants it back. I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you don't. Here's the thing, though. We know he went north this morning. We know where he's going. And we know what he's planning to do with those records. The man's grin widened. So here's the deal. You call him. Tell him to bring those records to Mr. Vane. Do that, and everyone walks away happy. And if I don't, then Mr. Vane stops being patient. And trust me, you don't want that. Clara's mind raced. They knew about the safety deposit box, which meant they'd been watching, waiting for Rowan to lead them to the evidence, which meant Rowan was walking into a trap. I'll think about it, she said, buying time. You do that, but don't think too long. Mr. Vane's not a patient man. The man climbed back into his truck and drove away, leaving deep ruts in the snow. The moment he was gone, Clara grabbed her phone and called Rowan. It went straight to voicemail. She tried again, still nothing. Panic started clawing at her chest. She called Margaret. They know, Clara said the moment her sister answered. They know where Rowan went. They're going to intercept him, Margaret swore. How do you know? One of Vane's men just showed up. He said they've been watching. Clara's hands were shaking. I can't reach Rowan. His phone's off or out of range. Where's the bank? Coldwater Ridge, 3 hours north. We're leaving now, James and I. We'll head there and see if we can find him. I'm coming too. Clara, he's my responsibility. I'm coming. There was a pause. Then Margaret said, Fine. Meet us at the gas station on Highway 7. We'll go together. Clara didn't bother packing. She just grabbed her coat, made sure Keeper had food and water, and climbed into the truck. The drive to the highway felt like it took hours instead of 20 minutes. By the time she pulled into the gas station, Margaret and James were already there, the SUV idling. Clara parked and jumped into their back seat. Let's go. James drove like he'd done this before, fast but controlled, taking the mountain roads with confidence. Margaret called the number Rowan had given them, but it still went to voicemail. What's the plan when we get there? Clara asked. We find him, James said simply, and we make sure Vane's men don't. And if they're already there? Then we call the police. Federal authorities if we have to, but we don't engage. That's important. No matter what happens, we don't put ourselves in the line of fire. Clara wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. Going in guns blazing, literally or figuratively, would only make things worse. They made it to Coldwater Ridge in just over 2 hours, pushing the speed limit the whole way. The town was small and sparse, the kind of place where everyone noticed strangers. James pulled into the parking lot of the bank, a squat brick building with a faded sign. Rowan's truck was parked out front. So was Marcus Vane's sedan. Damn, Margaret breathed. James cut the engine. Stay here. I'm going to assess the situation. I'm coming with you, Clara said. Clara, I'm coming with you. James looked at her, seemed to recognize that arguing was pointless, and nodded. Stay behind me. And if things go bad, you run. Understood? Understood. They approached the bank carefully. Through the windows, Clara could see people moving inside. Normal customers doing normal business. No signs of trouble. James pushed open the door and they stepped into the small lobby. A teller looked up, smiling automatically. Behind her, through a doorway marked private, Clara could hear voices. Can I help you? The teller asked. Before James could answer, the private door opened and Rowan emerged, briefcase in hand. He stopped dead when he saw them. Clara, what are you doing here? They know, she said. Vane's men. They came to the cabin. They said they were watching you. Rowan's expression darkened. When? 2 hours ago. Then they're not here yet. We need to go. Now. But even as he said it, the bank's front door opened behind them. Clara turned and felt her blood go cold. Marcus Vane stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 men. He smiled when he saw Rowan. Going somewhere? The bank went very quiet. The teller behind his counter looked confused and frightened. An elderly couple near the ATM froze. This is a public place, James said, his lawyer voice crisp and authoritative. You're welcome to conduct your business, but harassment is illegal. Vane's smile didn't waver. Who's harassing anyone? I'm just here to have a conversation with an old friend. His eyes locked on the briefcase in Rowan's hand. That's quite a collection of documents you've got there. My documents. They're not yours, Rowan said. They're evidence of your crimes. And I'm turning them over to federal authorities today. Are you? Vane took a step forward. His men moved with him, closing off the exit. See, I don't think you are. I think you're going to hand me that briefcase, and then you're going to walk away and forget any of this ever happened. And if I don't? Vane's expression went cold. Then people get hurt, starting with Miss Whitlock. Clara felt Rowan tense beside her. But before anyone could move, James stepped forward, pulling out his phone. Mr. Vane, I'm James Chen, attorney at law, and I need to inform you that this conversation is being recorded. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court. I'd also like to point out that threatening someone in a federal bank, in front of multiple witnesses, constitutes several felonies. Vane stared at him. You're bluffing. I'm not. And my partner is currently outside with local police and federal agents. They've been standing by for the last 20 minutes, waiting for confirmation that you'd make an appearance. James's smile was sharp as a blade. You're under arrest, Mr. Vane, or you will be in about 30 seconds. Vane's face went white, then red. You're lying. Am I? As if on cue, the door opened again and 3 people in FBI windbreakers entered, followed by 2 local police officers. The lead agent, a woman with steel gray hair and harder eyes, looked at Vane. Marcus Vane, I'm Special Agent Torres. We have a warrant for your arrest. Everything happened fast after that. Vane tried to run, but his men didn't follow. They were too busy surrendering. The agents cuffed Vane while reading him his rights, his protests growing louder and more desperate as reality sank in. Agent Torres turned to Rowan. You're Rowan Hale. Yes, ma'am. You have documentation of Mr. Vane's illegal operations. Rowan held up the briefcase. Everything you'll need. Torres took it carefully. We'll need you to come in for a full statement, but I want you to know what you've done here took courage. Men like Vane don't go down easy. You've done the right thing. Clara felt like she couldn't breathe. She watched Vane being led away in handcuffs, watched his men being questioned, watched federal agents swarm the bank to secure evidence. It felt surreal, like something from a movie instead of her actual life. Rowan touched her elbow gently. You okay? Is it over? Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. Is it really over? Yeah, he said. It's really over. Clara turned and buried her face in his chest, her whole body shaking with relief and leftover adrenaline. Rowan held her tight, one hand in her hair, murmuring reassurances she couldn't quite hear over the roaring in her ears. Margaret appeared beside them, putting a hand on Clara's shoulder. Let's get you outside. You need air. They walked out into the cold afternoon, leaving the chaos of the bank behind. Clara gulped in freezing air, trying to steady herself. "How?" she asked, looking at James. "How did you know he'd come here?" "I didn't know for certain, but I made some calls this morning, to federal contacts, to people who owed me favors. When you called and said Vane's men were watching Rowan, I put two and two together and made sure we had backup in place." James's expression was grim. It was a calculated risk, but men like Vane are predictable. They can't stand to lose. "Thank you," Clara said. "For everything." "Just doing my job." But James smiled, and it softened his sharp features. "Though I have to admit, this was more exciting than my usual corporate cases." They spent the next several hours at the local FBI field office, giving statements. Clara told them everything about finding Rowan in the storm, about the threats, about the confrontation at her cabin. Rowan went through the documents with Agent Torres, explaining what each piece of evidence proved about Vane's operations. By the time they finished, it was dark outside, and Clara was exhausted down to her bones. Agent Torres walked them out personally. "Mister, Vane will be facing federal charges. With the evidence you've provided, we're looking at a solid case. He won't be bothering either of you again." "What about his men?" Rowan asked. "They're cooperating. Most of them are just hired hands who didn't realize the extent of what Vane was doing. We'll sort it out, but my guess is they'll take plea deals in exchange for testimony." They drove back to Frost Hollow in Margaret's SUV, all of them too tired to talk much. Clara sat in the back with Rowan, her hand clasped in his, watching the dark landscape slide past the windows. When they finally pulled up to the cabin, Clara had never been so happy to see her home. Keeper was waiting on the porch, tail wagging furiously. She climbed out of the SUV and went straight to him, dropping to her knees to hug him while he licked her face. Margaret and James stayed for coffee, all of them too wired to sleep despite the exhaustion. They sat around Clara's table, rehashing the day's events, trying to make sense of how close things had come to going very wrong. "You'll need to be careful for a while," James warned. "Vane may be in custody, but he still has connections. Don't be surprised if there's some blowback." "Like what?" Clara asked. "Threats, probably. Maybe legal harassment, nuisance lawsuits, that kind of thing. But with the federal case against him, most of it will be toothless." James pulled out a card and handed it to her. "If anything happens, anything at all, you call me, day or night." Clara took the card, feeling the weight of it. "I will. Thank you." "You're welcome." James stood, Margaret following. "We should get back to the hotel. Let you two get some rest." At the door, Margaret pulled Clara into another fierce hug. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. "So proud. I couldn't have done it without you." "Yes, you could have, but I'm glad you didn't have to." Margaret pulled back, her eyes wet. "Come visit me sometime, in the city. Bring Rowan. Let me show you off to my friends." "I'd like that." After they left, Clara and Rowan stood in the quiet cabin, just breathing. The fire had burned down to embers. The clock on the wall said it was past midnight. "We should sleep," Rowan said. "Yeah." But neither of them moved. They just stood there, hands clasped, trying to accept that it was really over. "I keep waiting for something else to happen," Clara admitted. "Like there's another shoe waiting to drop." "I know, but there isn't. We won." "Did we?" "Look around, Clara. You're standing in your home. I'm standing beside you. Vane's in custody. We survived. That's winning." Clara looked at him, at this man who'd crashed into her life and refused to leave, who'd brought danger and trouble, and also something she'd never expected to find: hope. And she realized he was right. They'd survived. Together. And that meant everything. "Come on," she said, pulling him toward the bedroom. "Let's get some sleep." They lay down fully clothed, too tired to do anything else, and were asleep within minutes. The weeks that followed felt like waking up from a long, strange dream. Marcus Vane's arrest made headlines, not nationally, but enough that everyone in Frost Hollow and the surrounding towns knew what had happened. People Clara hadn't spoken to in years suddenly wanted to talk to her, congratulate her, hear the story firsthand. She hated it. But Rowan handled it with surprising grace, deflecting attention, keeping things brief, protecting Clara from the worst of the curiosity. The federal case moved forward quickly. Vane's lawyer tried to get the charges dismissed, but with the evidence Rowan had provided, It was hopeless. 3 months after his arrest, Vane pleaded guilty to a dozen federal charges and was sentenced to 15 years. Clara and Rowan drove to Margaret's apartment to celebrate. Her sister had cooked an elaborate meal and invited James, who showed up with expensive wine and stories about his next big case. "To justice," Margaret said, raising her glass. "To family," Clara countered. They drank, and Clara felt something shift inside her. She was surrounded by people who cared about her, who'd fought for her, who'd proven that letting people in didn't have to mean getting hurt. Later that night, standing on Margaret's balcony overlooking the city lights, Rowan came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything. How much has changed? How different my life is now compared to a year ago." "Is that good?" Clara leaned back against him. "Yeah, it's really good." "Good enough that you'd want to make it permanent?" Clara's breath caught. She turned in his arms to face him. "What?" Rowan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside was a simple ring, silver, with a small stone that caught the light. "I know it's fast. I know we've only known each other a few months. But Clara, you're the best thing that ever happened to me. You gave me a home when I had nothing. You stood beside me when you had every reason to walk away. And I want to spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worth the risk you took." He opened the box fully. "Marry me?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. She thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, lonely, isolated, convinced that walls kept you safe. Then she thought about the woman she was now, someone who'd learned that the only thing walls did was keep you small. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." Rowan slipped the ring onto her finger, and they kissed while the city lights sparkled below them, and Margaret cheered from somewhere inside the apartment. They were married in the spring, in the cabin where they'd first found each other. Margaret stood as Clara's maid of honor, James served as Rowan's best man, and Daniel Morrison showed up with a bottle of whiskey and a grudging acknowledgement that maybe Clara had known what she was doing after all. It was a small ceremony, just a handful of people who mattered, a local minister who'd known Clara's parents, and Keeper wearing a bow tie that he immediately tried to remove. Clara wore a simple white dress and carried wildflowers from her garden. Rowan wore his best jeans and a shirt Clara had never seen him in, his hair combed back and his green-gray eyes bright with happiness. When the minister pronounced them married, Clara kissed her husband and felt like her whole life had been leading to this moment. Not to the wedding, but to the choice to let someone in, to trust, to believe that love wasn't a liability, but a lifeline. The year that followed was the happiest of Clara's life. She and Rowan worked the land together, fixing what was broken and building what was new. They expanded the garden, added more chickens, repaired the barn roof properly, instead of with temporary patches. Clara started painting again, not just occasionally, but regularly, setting up a small studio in the storage room and filling canvases with the life she'd built. In the fall, they sold their first painting at a craft fair in Frost Hollow. By winter, Clara had commissions from 3 different people. By spring, a gallery in the city was interested in showing her work. "You should do it," Rowan said when she told him about the gallery offer. "You're talented, Clara. People should see that. It means spending more time away from the property." "So? I can handle things here for a few days." He pulled her close. "Besides, I like having something to brag about. My wife, the artist. You're impossible. You love me anyway." Unfortunately, but she was smiling when she said it. The following year brought changes Clara hadn't expected but found herself welcoming anyway. Margaret visited more often, sometimes bringing dates who never quite worked out but always tried their best with the chickens and the goats. Daniel Morrison got married to someone from the next town over and stopped looking at Clara like she'd made a mistake. The cabin, which had once felt like a fortress, started feeling like a home people actually wanted to visit. And in late autumn, Clara discovered she was pregnant. She told Rowan on a cold November evening while they sat by the fire drinking tea and playing cards. She'd been nervous all day, unsure how he'd react, worried that maybe they weren't ready, that maybe this was too much too fast. But when she said the words, Rowan's face lit up like sunrise. "Really? Really?" He pulled her into his arms so tight she could barely breathe, laughing and kissing her and murmuring things she couldn't quite hear but felt all the way through her bones. "We're going to be parents," he said, wonder in his voice. We are. That's terrifying. I know. And amazing. I know that too. Their daughter was born the following summer, a beautiful, screaming, perfect baby girl with dark hair and her father's green-gray eyes. They named her Finn after the brother Rowan had lost, and Clara cried when she held her for the first time, overwhelmed by love so fierce it felt like drowning and flying at the same time. Margaret showed up the next day with enough baby supplies to stock a store and opinions about everything from feeding schedules to nursery colors. She held her niece like she was made of glass and cried almost as much as Clara had. "You're going to be an amazing mother," Margaret told Clara. "How do you know?" "Because you learned from the best bad example." Margaret smiled through her tears. "You know what not to do. And you have Rowan, and you have me, and that baby is going to be so loved she won't know what to do with it all." Clara looked down at Finn, sleeping peacefully in her arms, and realized her sister was right. This child would grow up knowing love, messy, imperfect, but real. She'd grow up in a home where people said what they meant and fought for each other and didn't just go through the motions. She'd grow up the way Clara should have, the way Clara's children deserved to. On Finn's first birthday, Clara and Rowan threw a party. The cabin was packed with people. Margaret and James, Daniel and his wife, neighbors from Frost Hollow, friends from the craft fair circuit. Keeper wore another bow tie and tolerated children pulling his tail with remarkable patience. The goats got loose and caused chaos in the garden. Someone brought a guitar, and there was music and laughter, and the kind of joy that Clara had once thought was just something that happened to other people. Standing on the porch watching it all, holding her daughter on her hip while Rowan argued good-naturedly with James about something Clara couldn't hear, she felt complete in a way she'd never imagined possible. Margaret appeared beside her with 2 cups of punch. "You look happy." "I am happy." "Good. You deserve it." Margaret clinked her cup against Clara's. "To second chances." "To second chances," Clara echoed. That night, after everyone had gone home and Finn was asleep in her crib and the cabin was finally quiet again, Clara and Rowan sat on the porch in the darkness. The stars were out, brilliant and countless, and the air was warm with the promise of summer. "Do you ever think about that night?" Clara asked. "The storm, when you showed up here." "Every day. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I'd left you there?" Rowan was quiet for a moment. "I'd probably be dead or still running. Either way, I wouldn't be here. With you, with Finn, with all of this." He gestured at the property around them. "I got lucky." "We both did." "Yeah, we did." Clara leaned her head on his shoulder, listening to the night sounds, crickets and distant owls and the soft rustle of wind through trees. This was her life now. Not surviving, not just getting by. Actually living, with a partner who saw her, a daughter who needed her, a home that felt like it had always been waiting for her to figure out what it meant. "I love you," she said quietly. "I love you too." They sat like that until the sky began to lighten in the east, heralding another day, another chance to build something good from nothing, another morning that promised to be better than the last. And when the sun finally rose over the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and pink, Clara Whitlock, who had once believed that love was a liability and safety meant being alone, looked at her life and saw only possibility. She'd chosen to let someone in. She'd chosen to fight instead of hide. She'd chosen love over fear. And standing there in the dawn light with her family sleeping inside and her whole future stretching out before her, Clara realized something that would have terrified her years ago, but now felt like the truest thing she'd ever known. She'd chosen right. The silence no longer weighed on her chest like a burden she had to carry. It didn't press down with the heaviness of loneliness or echo with the absence of something essential. Instead, it wrapped around her like a blanket she'd woven herself. Threads of laughter and argument and quiet understanding all twisted together into something warm and real. The silence, at long last, felt like home. And Clara Whitlock, who had spent so many years believing she preferred to be alone, discovered that the best thing she'd ever done was open her door to a stranger in a storm and let him stay. Not because she needed saving, but because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit that you don't have to do everything alone, that asking for help isn't weakness, that letting someone see you, really see you, walls down and heart exposed, is its own kind of strength. Years from now, when Finn was old enough to ask how her parents met, Clara would tell her the truth about the storm and the stranger and the choice that changed everything. She'd tell her daughter that love isn't always easy, that sometimes it comes with complications and danger and moments that test every wall you've ever built around yourself. But she'd also tell her that it's worth it, every single time. Because the alternative, safety without warmth, survival without joy, existence without connection, isn't really living at all. It's just waiting to die. And Clara Whitlock was done waiting. She was living, fully, completely, with all the mess and beauty and terrifying vulnerability that came with letting yourself be known by another person. And she'd never been happier.